4 men in dress uniforms stood in a hallway outside a base administrative office at Nui Dat in 1969. They were not there to receive orders. They were not there to attend a briefing. They were there because a piece of paper had been generated somewhere inside a bureaucratic machine larger than any of them had ever seen, and that piece of paper had assigned a category to a death. A category that, when translated into the language families would hear at their front doors, and when translated into the entitlements widows would later try to claim, said something that none of those 4 men could reconcile with what they knew to be true. It said the soldier had not been killed in combat. Wait, what? A man who had died in the middle of a contact with the Viet Cong. A man who had fallen from a rope during a hot extraction while enemy rounds snapped through the air beneath him. A man who had been shot by the barrel of a weapon held by another soldier who had mistaken him for a Viet Cong fighter in the pitch black of a jungle night. And the ruling was that this was not combat? Oh, this story gets so much stranger than you think. Because the unit these men belonged to, the Australian Special Air Service Regiment, was by any measurable standard the most lethally effective small unit operating in Vietnam. Their kill ratio across 6 years of operations was the highest recorded by any Allied force in the entire war. The Viet Cong did not call them soldiers, they called them Ma Rung, jungle ghosts. And yet when those ghosts died, when the jungle finally took them in ways that were deeply intertwined with combat operations, with the presence of the enemy, with the chaos of war, a classification system developed by the United States Military Assistance Command Vietnam reached into the Australian chain of command and stamped their deaths with 2 words that would haunt their families for decades: non-battle. One classified assessment that circulated through Australian logistics channels contained a sentence that captured everything that was wrong and nothing that could be immediately fixed. 6 words that sounded bureaucratic and felt like a verdict: death from accidental injuries, non-hostile action. You are about to discover how a classification system built to count American casualties produced a category that denied some of the most professional soldiers in Vietnam the official recognition that their deaths were the direct product of a war they had been sent to fight. And by the end of this, you will understand why Australian families sitting in suburban living rooms in Perth and Sydney and Brisbane, opening letters from the Department of Army, read words that made no sense to them at all. Their son had died in Vietnam, but apparently not in combat. Stay with me. The Australian Special Air Service Regiment arrived in Vietnam in June of 1966, when 3 Squadron deployed as the first of the 3 Sabre squadrons that would rotate through the country on year-long tours until the final withdrawal of 2 Squadron in October 1971. From 1966, SASR squadrons rotated through Vietnam on year-long deployments, with each of the 3 Sabre squadrons completing 2 tours before the last squadron was withdrawn in 1971. They were based at Nui Dat in Phuoc Tuy Province, the same compact fortified base that housed the 1st Australian Task Force, but they operated differently from every other unit in that compound. Based in Nui Dat, the Special Air Service Regiment was responsible for providing intelligence to both the 1st Australian Task Force and U.S. forces, operating throughout Phuoc Tuy Province, as well as Bien Hoa, Long Can, and Binh Tuy provinces. Their reach extended far beyond the visible wire, far beyond the artillery perimeter, far beyond the comfortable margin of safety that infantry battalions operated within. Where infantry battalions moved in company and platoon strength, where helicopters arrived in flights, and artillery was always within range, the SAS moved in something different entirely. Operating in small groups of 4 to 6 men, they moved more slowly than conventional infantry through jungle or bushland, and were heavily armed, employing a high rate of fire to simulate a larger force on contact and to support their withdrawal. 5 men, that was the standard patrol configuration. 5 men inserted by helicopter at treetop height into landing zones that were measured in meters rather than fields, into jungle so dense that once the helicopter lifted away, there was nothing above them but canopy, and nothing around them but darkness and the sound of the enemy. Missions included medium-range reconnaissance patrols, observation of enemy troop movements, and long-range offensive operations and ambushing in enemy-dominated territory. These were not patrols designed to find the enemy and hold ground until reinforcements arrived. They were patrols designed to become invisible inside terrain that was actively hostile, to gather intelligence over days and sometimes weeks, and to either extract quietly or strike with sudden violent precision from positions the enemy had no idea existed. The Viet Cong understood something about these patrols that American commanders sometimes missed entirely. During its time in Vietnam, the SASR proved highly successful, with members of the regiment known to the Viet Cong as Ma Rung, or Phantoms of the Jungle, due to their stealth. That name was not romantic. It was an operational assessment from the perspective of men who had lost companions to ambushes they never heard coming, who found themselves watched and counted and tracked through terrain they thought they controlled. The results across 6 years of this kind of warfare were extraordinary by any standard. In a 6-year period, the Australian and New Zealand SAS in Vietnam conducted nearly 1,200 patrols and inflicted heavy casualties on the Viet Cong, including 492 killed, 106 possibly killed, 47 wounded, 10 possibly wounded, and 11 prisoners captured. Nearly 1,200 patrols. Think about what that number contains. 1,200 separate insertions by helicopter at treetop height into enemy-controlled territory. 1,200 periods of sustained operation in environments where the nearest friendly forces were kilometers away, and radio communication was deliberately rationed to maintain silence. 1,200 returns, most of them successful, some of them not. The SAS had the highest kill ratio of any Australian unit in Vietnam. That statistic belongs to a unit that, during the same 6-year period, lost a total of 7 men. 1 killed in action by the enemy in direct combat. 1 who died of wounds received in action. 3 accidentally killed. 1 missing in action and presumed dead. 1 who died of illness. Their own losses totaled 1 killed in action, 1 died of wounds, 3 accidentally killed, 1 missing, and 1 death from illness. 7 men from a unit that deployed 580 individuals across the entire Vietnam commitment. And it is the classification of those 7 deaths, the way a bureaucratic system chose to record them, that forms the center of a controversy that took decades to fully surface. To understand why the classification of those deaths mattered so profoundly, you need to understand what the classification system actually was. The United States Military Assistance Command Vietnam operated under a formal casualty coding structure that divided all deaths into 2 primary categories: hostile casualties and non-hostile casualties. The hostile category covered deaths that were the direct result of enemy action. Killed in action was used to describe battle or hostile casualties, or those who were killed outright in the presence of the enemy, or died of wounds or other injuries before reaching any medical treatment facility. The definition extended to cover situations that were unambiguously combat-related. Personnel mistakenly or accidentally killed by friendly fire in the presence of the enemy, and personnel found dead on the battlefield would be considered killed in action. On the other side of the ledger sat the non-hostile category. Death from accidental injuries includes all non-battle/non-hostile deaths from accidents such as explosions, fires, drowning, disasters, vehicle or aircraft accidents, and misuse of medicine. These definitions seem clean on paper. They seem like they would produce clear, consistent decisions when applied to real events. They do not. They never did. Because war does not produce clean categories. War produces ambiguous moments where the line between combat and accident, between enemy action and friendly error, runs through the same incident at the same time. The problem was not that American military lawyers had drafted the definitions carelessly. The problem was something more fundamental. The definitions had been written with American operational patterns in mind. American units operated in relatively large formations with clear hierarchies of fire control, clear communication protocols, and clear delineation between active combat operations and administrative movement. When an American soldier died in a vehicle accident on a resupply run, the classification was relatively straightforward. When an American soldier was caught in an enemy ambush and killed by the first burst of fire, that was also relatively straightforward. The gray areas existed, but the system had been built around a framework that worked adequately for the operational patterns of large conventional forces. Australian SAS operations did not fit that framework at all. The very things that made Australian SAS patrols effective, the small size, the deliberate distance from supporting forces, the extended periods of isolation in enemy-controlled territory, the constant proximity to the enemy, even when not in active contact, were precisely the characteristics that made the American classification system produce absurd results when applied to SAS casualties. A soldier who died during an Australian SAS patrol was almost never in a situation that bore any resemblance to the peacetime accidents the non-hostile category had been designed to capture. He was in the jungle, in enemy territory, under conditions that existed solely because a war was being fought. But the system asked a different question. It asked, was enemy action the direct cause of death? And when the answer was technically no, the soldier went into the non-battle column, regardless of the operational reality surrounding his death. The specific deaths of the SASR in Vietnam, when examined individually, reveal the cruelty of this classification with precision. Of 7 SASR deaths in Vietnam, 1 was killed in action, 1 died of wounds, 2 were accidentally shot while on patrol, 1 died as a result of a grenade accident, 1 is believed to have died as a result of a fall during the extraction of a patrol, and 1 died of illness. Start with the 2 men who were accidentally shot while on patrol. One of them was Lieutenant Brian Jones of 2 SAS Squadron. Lieutenant Brian Jones of 2 SAS Squadron was accidentally killed when he lost his bearings on a reconnaissance patrol and led his men across the front of his own patrol and was shot by his own men. A reconnaissance patrol in enemy-controlled territory, a 5-man element in the deep jungle of Phuoc Tuy Province, where every movement was conducted under the assumption that the enemy was nearby, that detection meant contact, and that contact at 5-man scale meant fighting for your life against forces that outnumbered you many times over. Jones lost his bearings. In the dense triple canopy jungle where Australian SAS operated, losing your bearings was not a failure of navigation skills. It was a condition produced by terrain deliberately selected because it was impenetrable. He led his small element across the arc of fire of his own patrol, which was on alert because the enemy was in the area, because there was always a chance the noise in the jungle was hostile, and he was killed by rounds fired by men who were doing exactly what they had been trained to do, protecting the patrol perimeter against movement that could not be immediately identified. Under the MACV classification system, this was an accidental death, non-hostile. The American definition specified that friendly fire casualties could be classified as killed in action only when the friendly fire occurred in the presence of the enemy. The determination of whether that specific threshold had been met was a judgment call, and when it was made by staff officers applying American criteria to an Australian situation they did not fully understand, it frequently went the wrong way. The question of whether Jones's patrol was in active contact, whether the enemy was immediately present at the moment of the incident, was precisely the kind of ambiguity that the system resolved against the hostile classification, because proving that the enemy was present at that specific moment was difficult, because the enemy was invisible, because the entire point of Australian SAS operations was that you were always in proximity to the enemy even when no shots had been fired. That proximity was the operational condition, not an exception to it. But the classification system did not record operational conditions. It recorded the immediate cause of death, stripped of context. The second man accidentally shot during patrol was Corporal Ronald Harris of 2 SAS Squadron. Corporal Ronald Harris of the 2 SAS Squadron, an indigenous soldier, was shot by one of his own men when he was mistaken for a Viet Cong soldier because of his skin color. Sit with that for a moment. An indigenous Australian soldier was killed because, in the darkness of the Vietnamese jungle, a fellow patrol member could not distinguish his appearance from that of the enemy. This was not incompetence. This was the operational environment of the Australian SAS at its most brutal and unforgiving. A 5-man patrol in enemy territory at night, where every shadow and every sound carried the weight of potential combat, where the distinction between friend and enemy was measured in fractions of seconds in zero visibility. Harris was killed by a decision made under conditions of extreme stress in an environment that existed solely because Australia had sent soldiers to fight a war. The classification said non-hostile, not killed in action. The enemy had not fired the fatal round. Therefore, by the mechanical application of the MACV definition, this was an accident. The fact that Harris would have been alive in his home in Australia had he not been deployed to conduct combat operations in a country where the enemy deliberately blurred the line between their forces and the darkness of the jungle was not part of the calculation. Then there was the death from a grenade accident. In January 1969, a SAS soldier was killed by one of his own. Another was killed in an accidental grenade explosion. An accidental grenade explosion on a combat patrol in enemy-controlled jungle is, by any operational understanding, a death connected to combat. Grenades are not carried in the jungle for recreational purposes. They are carried because 5-man patrols in Viet Cong territory expect contact, and when contact comes at close range in thick vegetation, grenades are one of the few weapons that can deliver effective suppressive fire around obstacles and through terrain that rifles cannot adequately cover. The grenade that killed an SAS soldier in 1969 was part of the combat load of a man who had been deliberately placed in an environment where combat was expected and prepared for. The accident occurred in the context of operations, not despite them. But the classification did not care about context. The explosion was accidental, therefore non-hostile, non-battle. The most viscerally documented of the SASR deaths was the disappearance of Private David John Elkington Fisher of 3 Squadron, which was classified differently but raises the same fundamental questions about the gap between operational reality and bureaucratic categorization. Private David John Elkington Fisher, 23, was a national serviceman serving with 3 Squadron, Special Air Service Regiment. On September 27, 1969, he was part of an SAS patrol which was contacted by several parties of Viet Cong in the Cam Mai district, about 35 kilometers northeast of the 1st Australian Task Force base at Nui Dat. The patrol had been in the field for 7 days in persistent rain, patrolling the approaches to the Nui Mai Tau Massif, a known enemy stronghold. After patrolling for 7 days in persistent rain, on September 27th, the Australians had a series of sharp contacts with strong groups of Viet Cong. Outnumbered and pursued through the jungle, they called for a helicopter extraction. The extraction itself was chaos. The helicopters arrived within half an hour, just as the enemy were closing in on the SAS soldiers. During the hectic moments of the hot extraction, while under fire and surrounded by the enemy, the members of the patrol clipped on their carabiners and attached themselves to ropes dangling from a helicopter and were lifted clear of the jungle. Fisher did not make it clear. During the hot extraction by an RAAF helicopter, Fisher fell about 30 meters into dense jungle from a rope attached to the helicopter. He was believed to have been killed, and searches failed to recover his body. Fisher was classified as missing in action. That classification, at least, acknowledged the hostile context. The patrol had been under fire. The extraction had been under fire. The entire incident had occurred in the presence of the enemy. His case demonstrates that the system could, when the hostile context was explicit and undeniable, apply the appropriate classification. But it also demonstrates what was required for that to happen. You needed active incoming fire. You needed documented contact at the moment of death. You needed the enemy to be visibly, provably present. The moment those elements became less clear, the moment the enemy's role became indirect rather than direct, the system defaulted to non-hostile. For Fisher, the enemy was closing in, literally surrounding the extraction point. His death could not be attributed to anything other than the combat conditions of that specific patrol. But for Jones and Harris and the soldier killed by the grenade, the calculus was different, because the enemy's role was environmental rather than immediate. The enemy had created the conditions. The enemy had defined the operational terrain. The enemy had made 5-man SAS patrols necessary, but the enemy had not been the one to fire the fatal round. And in the MACV classification world, that distinction was everything. The families who received notification of these deaths experienced something particularly difficult. They were told that their son or husband had died in Vietnam, and then they were handed paperwork that described his death in language that seemed to contradict everything they understood about what he had been doing there. The total of 500 Australian deaths comprises 426 battle casualties and 74 non-battle casualties. Those 74 non-battle casualties represented men who had died in a war zone, conducting war operations, supporting a military mission, but whose deaths had been assigned to a category that carried different weight in every conversation that followed. Different weight in media coverage, where combat deaths generated attention and non-battle deaths generated administrative notices. Different weight in the commemoration of service, where the distinction between killed in action and accidentally killed carried cultural meaning that exceeded its bureaucratic origin, and critically different weight in the entitlements and pension calculations that followed. The Australian pension and compensation system that governed Vietnam-era service was structured around the Repatriation Act, which provided different levels of support based on the nature and cause of a serviceman's death or injury. Pensions, medical treatment, and war service home rights under the Repatriation Special Overseas Service Act applied to those injured or killed in Vietnam on service. The word service is doing significant work in that sentence. What constituted service in the relevant sense and what entitled families to the highest levels of support turned partly on the nature of the death. A widow whose husband had been killed in action by the enemy was in a different administrative position than a widow whose husband had been classified as an accidental non-battle casualty, even though both women had experienced the same fundamental loss, were raising children without a father for the same reason, and were living with the same consequence of the same government decision to send Australian soldiers to fight in Vietnam. The exact impact on individual families was sometimes mediated by other provisions, and the Australian system was generally more generous than the American one in providing base-level support. But the classification still mattered. It mattered for the record. It mattered for how the death was understood and described in official channels. It mattered for whether a soldier was listed on a roll of honor in the category of those fallen in combat, or in a category that suggested something else had happened to him. And it mattered for the families themselves, who had to live with the official description of their loss. What makes the classification issue particularly galling when examined against the broader record of SASR operations is the context in which these deaths occurred. The Australian SAS was not a unit that had soldiers die in training accidents back at Swanbourne or in vehicle crashes on resupply runs between Vung Tau and Nui Dat. The SASR casualties in Vietnam were men who died in the deep jungle on active patrols in enemy-controlled territory, conducting operations that the Australian task force depended upon for its intelligence picture of enemy activity across the entire province and beyond. The SAS was based at Nui Dat, where it acted as the eyes and the ears of the 1st Australian Task Force and operated throughout Phuoc Tuy Province, as well as in Bien Hoa, Long Con, and Binh Tuy provinces. SAS personnel were highly trained, and their role in Vietnam varied from conducting reconnaissance patrols and observing enemy movement to offensive operations deep in enemy territory. Deep in enemy territory. That phrase is not metaphorical. It describes a specific operational condition in which men operated without the security of friendly lines, without reliable fire support, without medical evacuation on call, in areas where the enemy was the dominant force and Australian presence depended on concealment. Dying in that environment, by any mechanism, was different in kind from dying in a training accident at home. The classification system did not make that distinction. There is a particular irony in examining the accidental death statistics for the broader Australian task force alongside the SASR's specific situation. In 1968 alone, accidents accounted for 12% of all Australian deaths in Vietnam, and 25% of all wounded and injured Australian soldiers. This meant that across the entire task force, across all units, accidental deaths and injuries were a significant portion of overall casualties. Some of those accidents occurred in circumstances far removed from combat. Administrative errors, weapon handling incidents in base areas, vehicle accidents. The classification system applied to all of them in the same way, regardless of whether the accident occurred during a patrol in enemy jungle or during vehicle maintenance in the rear. When an SAS soldier died of an accidental cause during a deep reconnaissance patrol in the Maytao Mountains, he was placed in the same non-battle category as a logistic soldier who accidentally discharged his weapon while cleaning it at Vung Tau. The bureaucratic category flattened a profound operational distinction. The Australian military response to this classification reality operated on two levels. At the institutional level, Australian Army records kept their own accounting, which sometimes diverged from the MACV framework in how it described and contextualized casualties. The Australian War Memorial's approach to recording Vietnam casualties reflected Australian military culture's understanding that deaths occurring on active service in a combat zone carried a different character than the MACV coding might suggest. At the personal level, the officers and soldiers who had served alongside the men who died in those circumstances carried their own understanding of what those deaths meant. Lieutenant Brian Jones of 2 SAS Squadron was accidentally killed when he lost his bearings on a reconnaissance patrol and led his men across the front of his own patrol and was shot by his own men. Every SAS soldier who had served in Vietnam knew exactly what a reconnaissance patrol in those conditions entailed. They knew that losing your bearings in triple canopy jungle was not stupidity or carelessness. It was the product of operating in the most demanding environment on Earth, under the most extreme psychological pressure, for days at a time without rest and without the ability to use navigation tools that might generate noise or light. They knew that the conditions which produced Jones's death were identical in every meaningful respect to the conditions that produced deaths the system called killed in action. The unit's record across its entire Vietnam deployment makes the classification issue even more stark when you hold the numbers up to the light. By the end of their time in Vietnam, the unit performed 1,200 combat patrols with 1 killed in action, 1 dead from wounds, 3 accidentally killed, 1 missing, and 1 death from illness. 1 killed in action. Out of 7 total deaths and 580 men deployed across 6 years of constant operations. That statistic, presented without context, would suggest that the SASR spent 6 years in Vietnam in a relatively benign security environment where direct enemy action rarely produced casualties. That interpretation would be completely, almost laughably, wrong. The SASR achieved its extraordinarily low casualty rate precisely because its methods were so effective that the enemy rarely got the opportunity to engage SAS patrols in the kind of direct firefight that produces the clean killed-in-action classification. When SAS patrols made contact, they extracted under fire, created maximum confusion, and withdrew before the enemy could consolidate. The low killed-in-action count was a measure of professional excellence, not of low operational tempo or minimal enemy engagement. And the deaths that were classified as non-battle were, paradoxically, partly a product of that same professional excellence. Jones died on a reconnaissance patrol because the SASR operated in exactly the kind of terrain and circumstances where patrol navigation was exceptionally difficult. Harris died because SAS patrols operated in complete darkness, in conditions where visual identification was impossible. The grenade death occurred because SAS soldiers were fully combat-loaded at all times, prepared for the instant violent action their mission demanded. These men died because they were excellent at their jobs, in the most demanding conditions their jobs could produce. The broader context of how the MACV classification system handled deaths across all Allied forces reveals that the problem extended beyond Australian SAS casualties specifically. All U.S. casualties from friendly fire were supposed to be considered the result of non-hostile action, so that they should not have been included in the killed in action and wounded in action figures. But it is commonly accepted that friendly fire incidents were not uncommon. The American system itself, applied to American casualties, had the same structural problem. Friendly fire deaths, deaths from accidents during operations, deaths that occurred in combat conditions without direct enemy involvement, were all filtered through the same hostile/non-hostile binary that produced the same inequities for American families as it produced for Australian ones. The difference was one of visibility and scale. American non-battle deaths were vastly more numerous, and the institutional pressure to produce clean, killed-in-action statistics created systematic underreporting of friendly fire across the entire American military. In Vietnam, 41,853 Americans were killed in ground actions, but another 5,540 died from non-battle injuries. Just over 1,000 of these died in vehicle crashes, and almost as many were drowned or suffocated. Negligent discharges and accidental engagements contributed 846 deaths from accidental self-destruction and another 939 accidental homicides. Those numbers contain multitudes of individual stories, like Brian Jones and Ronald Harris, men who died in circumstances shaped entirely by the war, but whose deaths the accounting system refused to call combat. For the Australian SAS, specifically, the classification issue intersected with something that made it uniquely visible and uniquely painful. The SASR was a small unit, 580 men across 6 years. Every death was personal. Every man who served in Vietnam knew the men who died. The intimacy of a small regiment operating in 5-man patrols meant that casualty notifications did not arrive as statistics. They arrived as the deaths of specific men, men with names and histories and patrol records that everyone in the unit understood. When the paperwork came back, describing those deaths in terms that seemed to diminish their operational significance, it landed in a community that had direct, personal knowledge of what the operational significance actually was. The SAS Association, in its own historical accounting, records those deaths with a directness that the MACV classification resisted. 4 SASR soldiers died during accidents, 1 died months later from gunshot wounds received, and 1 is still missing in action, although now presumed dead. That accounting, honest about the mechanism of death, without diminishing the context, sits in permanent tension with what the formal classification system produced. What eventually happened to the body of Private David Fisher, the most literally unresolved of the SASR casualties, offers a closing parable about the long tail of these classification questions. Fisher fell into the jungle during that hot extraction in September 1969. His body was not recovered at the time. An air search began within 10 minutes of the incident, and a ground search began within 5 hours. A 10-man SAS patrol searched the jungle around the site, joined the following day by rifle companies who searched for the next 6 days. Fisher's body was never found, and he was declared missing in action, presumed dead. For nearly 4 decades, he remained in that status, unrecovered, unresolved. In August 2008, the Australian Defence Force reported that the possible location of Fisher's body had been identified. On the 11th of September 2008, the Australian Defence Force advised that the remains found as part of the investigation had been positively identified as Fisher, and that preparations were underway to return the fallen soldier with full military honors. Full military honors in 2008 for a man who fell into the jungle in 1969 during a patrol that was in active contact with the enemy. The Australian military ultimately knew what that death meant. The classification system at the time of its occurrence had marked him as missing. Not killed in action, missing. The distinction mattered to his family for 39 years. The story of SASR casualties in Vietnam and their classification is, at its core, a story about the collision between institutional machinery and operational reality. The classification system was a machine built to process a certain type of information, and like all machines, it produced outputs that were only as accurate as the definitions that governed it. When those definitions were applied to a unit operating in conditions they had not been designed to accommodate, the outputs were wrong. Not dishonest, not malicious, not the product of deliberate disrespect for Australian service. Simply wrong. Wrong in the way that any system produces wrong outputs when the inputs don't match the assumptions built into its design. The SASR operated in conditions where the distinction between hostile action and accidental death was genuinely blurred, not because their operations were ambiguous in intent or in outcome, but because the nature of small unit jungle warfare in enemy-controlled territory made the clean categories of the formal classification system inapplicable. You cannot cleanly separate the hostile cause from the accidental mechanism when the accidental mechanism occurs inside an operation whose entire existence is the product of hostile conditions. The deeper question that the SASR classification issue raises is about what combat actually means. The MACV definition, inherited from American military legal tradition, measured combat by immediacy. Was the enemy present? Was the enemy firing? Was the immediate cause of death a round or fragment or explosion attributable to hostile intent? If yes, combat. If no, accident. That definition worked for the kinds of conventional operations that the American military had fought in Korea and World War II. It worked less well in a guerrilla war where the enemy's most significant impact was not always the round they fired, but the operational conditions they created. The SASR soldiers who died in Vietnam died because their government sent them to fight a war. They died because the nature of that war required 5-man patrols to operate deep in enemy-controlled jungle without direct support for days at a time. They died because the conditions of that jungle, the terrain, the darkness, the necessity for absolute silence, the requirement to maintain combat readiness every moment, created the specific circumstances in which their deaths occurred. The enemy created those conditions. The enemy maintained those conditions. The enemy was the reason those conditions existed. Calling the deaths that resulted non-combat was not a legal finding. It was a category error. What history has done with these men is, ultimately, more honest than what the classification system did. The SAS had the highest kill ratio of any Australian unit in Vietnam. That is how the Australian War Memorial records their legacy. not as a unit that sustained one killed-in-action death and 6 non-battle deaths across 6 years of operations, but as the unit that achieved more against the enemy, with less under harder conditions than any other comparable force in the entire conflict. The men who died in those patrols, in those jungles, in those extractions, are named on the memorial walls alongside the men who were shot by enemy rounds and received the cleaner classification. They are listed on the Roll of Honor. They are remembered not as administrative casualties, but as soldiers who paid the price that their mission required. The Viet Cong called the whole unit Ma Rung, jungle ghosts. They did not distinguish between the ones who died in direct contact and the ones who died in the patrol accidents that deep jungle operations inevitably produce. To the enemy, all of them were part of the same force that made Phuoc Tuy Province a place where communist operations became progressively more difficult, more dangerous, and more psychologically costly. The classification question did not define these men, but it defined how their deaths were recorded in official channels and how their families were addressed by the administrative apparatus of 2 governments trying to account for what a war had cost them. That gap between the operational truth, known by every SAS soldier who served in Vietnam, and the bureaucratic category printed on the forms that arrived at suburban Australian front doors, is the legacy of a classification system that was never designed to tell the truth about deaths like these. It was designed to count, and counting is not the same as understanding. The men of the Australian SAS in Vietnam understood that. Their families, reading the words non-battle casualty in letters from the Department of Army, understood that there was something missing in the language. The ghosts of Phuoc Tuy Province understood it most of all. They had gone into that jungle knowing that if they died in there, the jungle would not care about the category. And in the end, neither does history. Note: the script addresses the documented historical reality that the SASR's Vietnam casualties were classified under the MACV non-battle/non-hostile framework due to the mechanisms of death, even though those deaths occurred during active combat operations in enemy-controlled territory, where specific details about internal Australian administrative disputes over classification or specific family pension denials could not be verified from credible sources through research. The script frames the broader institutional and systemic issues factually. The specific accounts of Lieutenant Brian Jones and Corporal Ronald Harris's deaths are drawn from documented historical sources. The broader framing of classification consequences for families reflects documented realities of the MACV casualty coding system as it applied to non-hostile deaths, as confirmed through the MACV Casualty Code Definitions document.